You're tuned to BBC Radio 3, and now on Sound of Gaming, it's time for our cutscene feature. Composer Eric Gordon Berg has most recently worked on an alien horror game, The Grey Hill Incident, which has just launched. But before we tackle all things invasion-themed, I thought we'd look back at some of his fascinating past work. In particular, his score for the fan-made Elder Scrolls game, Beyond Skyrim, The New North. This is a very different version of the fantasy role-playing game, in which the fans themselves have created new quests and locations, meaning players don't have to wait for an official sequel. The experience was very different from the composer's perspective too.
People from all around the world have come together to compile their skill sets, everything from the music to the voice actors, the writers, the concept artists. And they take this and they've created new regions within the game world. I remember I'm on the computer and this video pops up for Beyond Skyrim Bruma, and it's a launch trailer. And down in the description, they had a link to a website. I went on there and there was hundreds of people and posts just commenting applications. Every time you refresh the page, it was like there was new ones. And at that time, I had really been getting into more of the orchestral side of music. And so I just thought, I wonder if these people need music. As fast as I could, I whipped up 2 tracks that were in that Elder Scrolls style. I put these 2 tracks together and I submitted them. I kept checking back every day and nobody was saying anything to me. About a week went by and I would go back and it was just kind of like my application, my post got skipped over. And about a month later, it popped back in my head and I was like, I wonder whatever happened with that. So I go back on the forum and around my post at that time, there's all this engagement happening on these threads and applications that were submitted. And sure enough, the next morning, I woke up with an application to the Morrowind project. I think the biggest identity or key factor to the music of the Elder Scrolls is that it is orchestral and it's melodic and all of these things, but at the end of the day, it's very atmospheric. It's about atmosphere. It's about hearing that music and being taken back to that area. You don't really hear the melody and think of that melody exactly. You think of that place, the place you were in the game the first time you heard it. And I feel like a lot of games don't really take that approach, and that's probably what makes the Elder Scrolls so special. When I first started the project, they were pretty early on in development. I was able to actually download an early build of the game where I could walk around and explore some of the areas and get a feel for what it was going to be like when you play it. So as I was walking around in the game, checking out these areas, I'm thinking of what can this soundtrack be that's different from the original, but still fit in with not only Skyrim, but just the overall style. So we kind of leaned into a lot of somber strings. There's tons of melodies that come back from the original, but they're explored in slightly different ways. It was definitely difficult to find the balance between creating something new and not just redoing what's already been done. We had to come up with a lot of original themes that would blend in alongside the already existing material from the Elder Scrolls 3. The most prominent one is the main theme for the New North, which shows itself in probably half the soundtrack in one way or another. It comes back in different ways. A lot of it's subtle ways that you don't really necessarily notice it's there unless you're listening for it. This was something that I've found a lot throughout the Skyrim soundtrack. There's all kinds of recurring melodies and chord progressions, and this was something that we did with the New North with all new melodies.
Music from Beyond Skyrim, The New North, from my guest today, Eric Gordon Berg. Welcome to Sound of Gaming, Eric.
Thank you for having me.
Now, we're going to stay in the realm of Skyrim for the moment before things get that little bit more alien a bit later on. So I just wanted to ask, part of what makes the Elder Scrolls games so thrilling, and you touched on it before, is the fact that we spend so much time just wandering, which means that you really have to create atmosphere with your music. How do you approach those quieter moments?
It really depends on, are you trying to make something that's a little more melodic or something that's a little more ambient to it? As you notice in the original game, if you've played it, there's a lot of these big sweeping orchestral suites that come through, but they're written in such a way that they still come off as background music. It's not like in your face blaring the whole time. And then there's a mix of this more ambient stuff that when they play basically in a playlist back and forth, you get a mix between these emotions and these energies that kind of go up and down as you're playing. And it really creates a different experience for different people depending on what they're doing in the game. Because the music isn't so strictly tied to what they're doing, there's a lot more room for sort of experimentation that's happening behind the scenes that the player's not really aware of.
So it feels like you're really having to create two different types of music here. So it's almost like you've got two different composer heads on creating these different directions. Does it feel like that for you, that you're thinking of composing for one thing and the other, or does it feel like a much more natural cohesion?
Yeah, there's definitely, for me personally, a completely different approach for it. There's so many different ways that you can write music these days, but I've found that if it's something that's more melodic and like a traditional sort of orchestral writing, I try and write it on the piano first. I'm not the greatest piano player, but I've found that if I can write something that sounds good and harmonically sort of cohesive on the piano, it usually always will translate across the orchestra. Whereas when it's more of this ambient type stuff, using a piano isn't going to give you that sort of immediate feedback while you're writing. If it's a string thing that we're doing with the orchestra, I'll start with an actual string patch on the keyboard, and I'll use that to find not a melody, but more of a sort of mood or a tone to the overall sound of what we're going for. A lot more of that's done on the computer itself, where I'm kind of inputting notes and moving things around and playing with dynamics, rather than the first approach where you're just playing on a piano like a kid and you're just trying to find what works.
In terms of the response, so when people were playing, were you surprised by the response? Did people get in touch and sort of tell you their sort of emotional connection with it? What was that like?
That was really crazy. I had people reach out to me talking about how the music had helped them through things like depression or studying for tests, things like that. I never imagined that a project like this would get that kind of attention.
We're going to listen to Daglin's Footsteps now from the New North Volume 2. Is there anything that you can tell me a little bit about this track and what's going on here?
You are pursuing the bad guy and you're kind of entering into this mystical, ancient place that has a lot of history to it. And you don't necessarily know what's around each corner, but it's not entirely frightening. It's a bit more curious.
And I'll prod you on that because it won't be a spoiler, is in terms of bringing up that curious atmosphere and that curious feeling. What was your choices of sort of instrumentation for that, or even pacing?
I find that it has more to do with the pacing itself. There was definitely some instrumentation choices there, like I think the harp does that really well. But I try and just change it up a lot as the music's going on, so it doesn't sit in one spot too long. But when it is in that sort of area, it remains consistent, and then it changes as you're kind of exploring throughout.
Daglin's Footsteps from Volume 2 of Beyond Skyrim, The New North by Eric Gordon Berg, who's still with me here on Sound of Gaming on BBC Radio 3. Now, Eric, the theme of this show has been about everything extraterrestrial, and your latest release is The Grey Hill Incident. And it's not about little green men, but significantly scarier grey aliens that have invaded a neighbourhood in the 90s. And listening to your main theme, it's got a really interesting combination of it starts off soothing and melodic, and then it brings in the threat. Did you have any sort of key influences for this?
This was a small indie studio called Refugium Games, and I'd asked them, what are you looking for in this main theme? And they'd sent me, things like the X-Files and, of course, Signs and stuff like that. And they said they wanted it to be a little bit creepier than some of that stuff. I sat down to write it, and kind of having that natural orchestral influence, I went with more of the Signs kind of feeling to it with the woodwinds and things, which it's like ominous but kind of beautiful at the same time. It draws you in, hooks you in, and then it turns in a moment really dark, and it kind of reflects that change of thinking about being in that scenario and looking out the window, and it's dark out and it's eerie and it's ominous, but then once that thing is there in front of you, it's there in front of you and you know what's about to happen.
Did the 1990s time period have an impact as well? Given you mentioned the X-Files, and we were in the middle of sort of grey alien sort of hype in the 90s.
Yeah, they wanted more of that sort of nostalgic alien approach, not just to the music, but the entire game itself. They didn't want to do this overly sci-fi kind of gory, shoot 'em up kind of game. It was supposed to be like, these are your typical gray aliens like people used to talk about with the flying saucers and the UFOs.
Do you think there are sort of set expectations for themes around aliens? Was that something in the back of your head that you kind of wanted to subvert?
Yeah, kind of. I didn't want to fall too much into a cliche, but at the same time, with the direction of the game kind of being on the nose gray aliens, I just tried to navigate that sort of middle area a little bit.
I always love asking this because everyone has a different answer. But how did you think about a horror soundtrack? Do you think that there are specific sounds that we find intrinsically scary?
I do. I think that it's a mix between dissonance, so things that sound unpleasant to your ears, and also the unexpected tempo and timing of things. So when you take those and combine them, that's kind of where you get the true horror element, I think.
Well, we're about to listen to the main theme from Grey Hill Instant now. Eric, thank you so much for coming on Sound of Gaming.
Thanks for having me on.
the main theme from the Grey Hill incident by my guest this month, Eric Gordon Berg. The game is out now on consoles and PC. You're listening to Sound of Gaming on BBC Radio 3 and BBC Sounds, with me, Louise Blain.